Welcome to this explainer. Right, let's just dive straight into this. Today, we're unpacking a grim, heavy, but absolutely essential historical topic. We're going to uncover not just the tragic events of history's darkest moments, but the highly calculated machinery that actually made them happen. We're examining the logic of annihilation, specifically how nations justify genocide. Now, we usually focus entirely on the devastating outcomes, right? The sheer loss of life, the destruction of whole communities. But historians who study mass atrocities will tell you that to truly understand these events, we have to look closely at the why and the how. How exactly is the stage set for something so horrific?
It really brings us to a profound, deeply unsettling question. How do you convince ordinary people to commit evil? Take a second to really think about that. We always like to think of the perpetrators of mass violence as monsters, people who are fundamentally different from you or me. But history tells a much more terrifying story. The people carrying out these acts, they're often just ordinary citizens. They're teachers, farmers, the guy living right next door. So what bridges the gap between living an ordinary life and participating in mass murder? It's a massive psychological puzzle, and the answer actually lies in the stories a society starts telling itself.
Now, we've got to dismantle a major misconception right off the bat. The myth is that bad leaders stand up at a podium, stroke a cartoonish villain mustache, and openly declare, "Hey, we're going to go commit some evil." That literally almost never happens. The terrifying reality is that violence is painstakingly framed as moral, necessary, defensive, or even deeply patriotic. Governments, militias, and propaganda systems work together to create incredibly sophisticated narratives, and they do this for one specific reason: to make the unthinkable seem not just acceptable, but completely unavoidable.
Section 1. The Armenian Genocide, the Internal Enemy.
To see this twisted logic in action, let's look at the Ottoman Empire between 1915 and 1917, right in the absolute chaos of World War I. But before we break down their justification, we really have to ground ourselves in the stark outcome. Around 1 million Armenians, a Christian minority living within the empire, were killed. This staggering, unimaginable loss of life was achieved through mass killings, systematic starvation, forced marches, and deportations. The sheer scale of it was massive. Which again begs the question, how on earth was a state able to mobilize the resources and the public will to do this to its own people?
Well, the crucial point is that Ottoman leaders didn't pitch this as murder. They executed a very calculated playbook. First step, because the Ottoman Empire was actively fighting Russia in the war, officials accused the Armenians of secretly supporting the Russian enemy. Even though most Armenians were just everyday civilians trying to survive, propaganda successfully painted the entire population as a bunch of disloyal traitors. Second step, promoting Turkish ethnic purity. The empire was weakening, and nationalist leaders started pushing the idea that survival depended entirely on a unified, purely Turkish and Muslim identity. Armenians were suddenly framed as outsiders threatening that survival. Which leads us directly to the third step, framing the violence as a strict military necessity. By convincing the public that national security was literally at stake, the government presented deportations and massacres as essential defensive maneuvers, rather than the genocide it truly was.
And to make that psychological leap, the language had to change. State propaganda relied heavily on totally dehumanizing terms. They called them parasites, traitors, dangerous conspirators, enemies within. By reducing a population of civilian men, women, and children to a literal disease threatening the broader society, the psychological barrier to committing violence was completely lowered. Once you convince someone they're fighting a parasite instead of their neighbor, empathy just vanishes.
Section 2. The Rwandan Genocide. The Self-Defense Myth.
Again, we have to start with the devastating human cost here. Approximately 800,000 people were murdered. But what makes this number even more shocking is the timeline. This all happened in a terrifyingly brief span of just 100 days. The sheer speed and the intimate nature of this violence, often carried out by literal neighbors using machetes and clubs, was driven by an extreme, incredibly effective propaganda machine.
Now, this brilliantly illustrates the long-term mechanics of that propaganda. We actually have to look back to the colonial era to understand it. European powers, specifically Belgium, arbitrarily divided Rwandans into rigid racial categories: Hutu, Tutsi, Twa, and falsely elevated Tutsis as racially superior. That planted deep, deep seeds of division and resentment. So, moving to the post-colonial era, extremist Hutu propaganda flipped this colonial script. They portrayed Tutsis not as fellow citizens, but as oppressive invaders who had to be violently eliminated for the Hutus to finally be free. By 1994, this powder keg exploded into preemptive mass murder, and it was pitched to the public as a matter of pure, urgent survival.
These weren't just whispered rumors either. Listen to the actual messages being blasted over the radio broadcast day in and day out. The enemy is coming. The nation is under attack. If we do not kill them, they will kill us. This created an overwhelming, inescapable mindset of preemptive violence. Ordinary citizens were completely convinced that they were literally fighting for their lives. Perpetrators later confessed that they truly believed they were protecting themselves and their country. The narrative wasn't about exterminating a people. It was framed entirely as self-preservation.
And just like we saw in the Ottoman Empire, it's the exact same pattern. Dehumanizing language was a critical tool. Tutsis were relentlessly referred to as cockroaches, snakes, and enemies of the nation. When you condition a whole population to view another group as vermin, you completely bypass human empathy. Killing a cockroach is seen as a necessary extermination, right? Not a crime. This specific language was essential to making the killing seem totally acceptable to the masses.
Section 3. Darfur. Security as a shield.
Once again, the narrative provided by the state in Sudan in 2003 was absolutely not one of mass murder. The stated justification was that the government was simply fighting armed rebels to restore national order, just a standard counterinsurgency operation. But the actual reality on the ground was a deliberate blurring of lines. The government and their allied militias treated entire civilian ethnic communities as enemy combatants. Mass violence against non-Arab groups was completely shielded behind the bureaucratic, legitimate-sounding language of military security operations.
And the military strategy itself reveals the true intent here. Look at the targets of this destruction: villages, wells, crops, food supplies. That's not just fighting armed rebels. This was a total destruction strategy. The government justified burning crops and poisoning wells as a way to weaken rebel support. But the true undeniable effect of that is making civilian survival completely impossible in that region. Let's be real, you don't destroy a community's water and food supply unless your ultimate goal is the complete eradication of that community.
Section 4. Shared Patterns. The Logic of Annihilation.
Having looked at these three distinct historical tragedies, a chillingly consistent blueprint just emerges right in front of us. Across the board, despite vastly different situations, locations, and eras, the stated justification is almost identical. In Armenia, it was national security. In Rwanda, survival and self-defense. In Darfur, counterinsurgency. The excuse for committing mass atrocities is literally always framed as an urgent necessity to protect the state and its true citizens.
So the absolute key takeaway here is understanding this blueprint. First, the target group gets labeled as inherently dangerous. Second, the very survival of the nation is claimed to be at imminent risk. Third, the resulting violence is carefully framed as purely defensive. And finally, because of this supposed existential threat, extraordinary, horrific action is deemed tragically necessary. The victims are actively cast as the aggressors. They become the invaders, the criminals, the animals. By flipping the script like that, the state reframes horrific violence as sheer patriotism.
Section 5. The deepest historical lesson. Persuading the ordinary.
What historians really want us to take away from this explainer is incredibly profound. Genocide depends just as much on calculated justification as it does on raw hatred. Because, most people simply don't view themselves as evil. So the ultimate danger doesn't always announce itself with blatant malice. The danger lies in the slow, gradual acceptance of stories that make violence appear moral. The true danger is when a society begins accepting the idea that some groups are just less human, and that some lives simply matter less than others. Once that premise is accepted, the rest of the blueprint easily falls right into place.
I really want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. If history proves time and time again that genocide and mass violence are almost always disguised in the language of self-defense, national security, and patriotism, well, how will we recognize the warning signs in today's narratives? It really forces us to listen much more critically to how our leaders and the media talk about marginalized groups, security, and the enemy. History isn't just about the past, right? It's a tool for decoding the present. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the narratives around you.